What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Corky and this is Craftspiracy. Welcome back everybody. Today we are going to be talking about Wilhelm Reich and his discovery of Orgone energy, and we will also be making an orgonite pyramid. We're going to be doing about 5 layers of 10 milliliters of clear resin in this project, and I have this little triangle mold here, little pyramid mold. I also have some little quartz crystals and this copper wire that I already twisted. I am still trying to figure out how to make this like a really nice twist. I was experimenting with wrapping it around the crystal. However, these crystals are very jagged and none of them are shaped the same, which makes it really difficult to like get a system down. So I've decided to just do a copper circle instead, this type of like ringed pattern, and I think this is going to work just fine. So while my epoxy warms up, I first want to tell you guys a little bit about orgonite, and I also wanted to go through a couple of definitions, being science, the scientific method, and pseudoscience. I want to kind of talk about the differences of those before we start making this. Like I said, my resin has to warm up anyways. So orgonite is basically constructed of alternating layers of organic material, which are basically non-metallic material, and then metallic material like steel or copper, some type of a metal. The kind of orgonite that we will be making today consists of a crystal. This is a quartz crystal, and by adding this quartz crystal into the resin, which is a shrinking plastic, it creates a piezoelectrical effect, which is basically accumulated by the pressure on some solid materials by like a mechanical pressure or force. For the alternating layers of organic material and metallic material, I have some beautiful amethyst here. They are all like very small tumbled stones. And then I also have a bag of copper chunks. So these are going to be my alternating layers. However, we will not be touching those in this layer. This layer will only consist of a clear resin, a clear quartz crystal, and this copper spiral. Together, these materials are basically going to be making an inside-out orgone accumulator, which we will describe later on in the video if you don't know what that is already. This orgonite is claimed to be able to charge the surrounding areas, and it's going to be most powerful around the faces of the shape. And like I said, this is a pyramid, so there are 4 sides to this that will be projecting out energy as well as from the bottom, and it kind of all comes up to a point and kind of like shoots up into the air. And there's a lot of scientific studies that go into this, and I will be mentioning those at the end of the video. But for today, we're basically just going to be focusing on Wilhelm Reich's studies with orgone energy. Wilhelm Reich's work with orgone energy was known to be pseudoscience, even though there was a lot of scientific studies that went into it proving otherwise, which is why I want to tell you guys the definition between science, the scientific method, and pseudoscience. So I have my notes in front of me, and I apologize for looking down during this part, but I need to read off them. I did not memorize these. So the definition of science is the intellectual and particle activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. The definition of the scientific method is a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation, testing, and modification of hypotheses. Now, moving on to the pseudoscience definition. Pseudoscience is a collection of beliefs or practices mistakenly regarded as being based on the scientific method, which we will find out later that there was plenty of studies going into the discovery of orgone and its properties and functions. Real quick before we get into this first layer, I want to explain what I'm doing. So I'm going to be placing this quartz crystal in the middle of this ring and placing it inside of the pyramid, so that way The ring will help keep the pyramid straight up, but I will not be putting it actually in the mold until I have some resin in here, and that is because pyramids obviously have a point at the top, so I need to make sure that I don't get an air bubble in that point, and then we will be placing these in here. With all that being said, let's get into the life of Wilhelm Reich. So Wilhelm Reich was born on March 24th, 1897 in Dubzow, Galicia, which used to be part of Austria-Hungary, but it's now part of the Ukraine. His parents' names were Leon and Cecile Reich, and he was actually the oldest of 3 siblings, but unfortunately the sister that was born a year after him did not make it through infancy, so growing up it was just him and his brother Robert that was a little bit younger than him. Eventually they ended up moving to Eisenach in Bukovina. I'm really hoping that I'm saying these right. I did try and look up pronunciations and wrote them down so that I wouldn't forget them, but that doesn't mean that my accent is proper. Anyways, in Eisenach, they ended up renting a cattle farm from Cecile's uncle, Joseph Blum. Wilhelm's family was actually pretty well off, and they were able to afford a tutor for him until the age of about 12 or 13 years old. Even though he didn't go to a public school of any kind, he still had some children around his age that lived nearby. However, he was forbidden to hang out with anyone that spoke Yiddish, and he was also forbidden from speaking Yiddish himself. If you don't know what Yiddish is, it's basically a High German dialect that was historically spoken by Ashkenazi Jews. It originated in Central Europe in about the 19th century, and it consists of the Hebrew alphabet, and it also combines Hebrew, Arabic, Slavic, and Romantic languages. The reason why the boys were forbidden to speak Yiddish is because their parents were actually Jewish, but they decided to raise their children as non-Jewish. While living at home, unfortunately, some people do speculate that he could have been a victim of childhood sexual abuse, which could have contributed to his lifelong interest in sexuality. So when William was about 12 or 13 years old, he ended up getting sent to an all-male gymnasium, which is basically like a preparatory school for university. This school was located in Czernowitz, and while he was there, his mother ended up passing away. In 1914, Leon ended up passing away from tuberculosis, and unfortunately, Wilhelm had to come home and manage the family farm. Luckily though, he was able to continue his studies, and he actually graduated a year later in 1950 with unanimous approval. Unfortunately though, in the same year of 1915, the Russians ended up invading Bukovina, and the Reich brothers had to flee. Reich wrote, "I never saw either my homeland or my possessions again. Of a well-to-do past, nothing was left." Poor guy. So between the years 1915 and 1918, Reich actually served in the Austrian-Hungary army, and this was during World War I. He served 2 years there as a lieutenant, but whilst he was in the army, he was like striving for some type of education. He just wanted to learn really badly. So after the war, he ended up enrolling at the University of Vienna, and he enrolled in law, but after 1 semester, he ended up switching it to medicine, which he absolutely loved. His brother Robert also came with him to the university, and they were not very well off, so they ended up living together in an unheated room, and they lived off of nothing but oats and soups and dried fruits from the university canteen. In 1919, Reich ended up meeting Sigmund Freud, who is an Austrian neurologist and also the founder of psychoanalysis. Reich had asked Freud for a reading list on sexology because he was doing a seminar based on that. Sexology is the study of human sexuality, interests, behaviors, and functions. That same year, Freud was very impressed with Reich's abilities, and he ended up letting the 22-year-old Reich start working with analytic patients. which was nice because this actually allowed him to earn a small income. I decided I'm going to go ahead and try and put a few amethyst in this layer. We'll see how it works. In October of 1920, he became an accepted and regular member of the Vienna Psychoanalytical Association. And he also started his own analysis with Isidor Sadger, and he was a forensic doctor and psychoanalyst himself. By July of 1922, Reich had graduated with both a bachelor's and an MD after only 4 years because of his veteran status. In 1922 to 1924, Reich continued his study in neuropsychiatry by working at the city's university hospital in the neurological and psychiatric clinic under Professor Julius Wagner von Jaeger. Simultaneously, he was also working at Freud's analytic outpatient clinic, and this was called the Vienna Ambulatorium. Reich also became the assistant manager of this place in 1924. Alright, that is where we are going to leave off the first layer of this orgonite, so I will see you guys in a few hours to continue the story and do our last couple layers. I'm sorry if the camera angle has changed at all, but it has been a few hours and we are finally ready to do our second layer on this piece. Because we finished our last layer with some amethyst crystals, we will be diving in with these copper chunks next. And I think I'm only going to mix 5 milliliters this time because when I measured out how much liquid this can hold, I did not put into consideration that I was going to be putting items in here that were going to kind of take up some of that space and make it so that we don't need as much resin in there. So yeah, I'm going to mix up 5 milliliters this time. So we left off in 1924, and during this year, Reich published a series of papers that were about orgastic potency. Reich had discovered orgastic potency when he was doing some research on Freud's libido idea. Reich argued that the ability to love depended on orgastic potency, the ability to fully discharge the libido. He also said that this was the main goal for character analysis. Around this time, Reich actually moved away from treating neurotic symptoms to observing chaotic lifestyles and antisocial personalities. He argued that neurotic symptoms like OCD were an unconscious way of controlling a hostile environment, such as poverty or child abuse. This is what he called body armor or character armor. In 1925, Reich published his first book titled The Impulsive Character, a psychoanalytic study of the pathology of self. Reich's work with character was very well received. Unfortunately, his work with orgastic potency really wasn't. In 1926, Reich's brother Robert ended up passing away from tuberculosis, and a year later, Reich himself ended up contracting it. And he spent a few months in the sanatorium, and there he went through kind of like a life-changing crisis, you could call it, and people described him coming home that year very angry. Unfortunately, that summer in July, he witnessed the July Revolt of 1927, and this changed him drastically, and it made him see things much differently. He claimed it was his first encounter with human irrationality. And in 1928, he actually ended up joining the Communist Party of Austria. In 1928, Reich visited the Soviet Union, returning even more convinced of the connection between sexuality and economic oppression. And it also made his need to want to integrate Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx's work. In 1930, Reich ended up moving to Berlin, where he joined the German Soviet Union, but unfortunately he grew tired of them not wanting to publish his work, so he ended up making his own publishing house and publishing his own work. And in my opinion, I think this is where his distrust for the Nazis came about, which will kind of come up later. And while there, he actually began treating patients outside the restrictions of psychoanalysis. He proposed a functional identity between character, emotional blocks, and body tension, which again he called character armor. He proposed that this was a defense containing memory, and that dissolving this armor could actually bring back repressed memories from childhood trauma. He found that some of his patients were holding their bodies differently after a successful psychoanalytic session, where in these sessions he would communicate with his patient's body through touch. So in 1933 and 1934, Reich began to be really outspoken about his dislike of the Nazis, and that was like very unlike the people in his field at the time. Reich actually wrote, "In 1933, I was denounced by the Communist Party, and in 1934, I was expelled from the International Psychoanalytic Association. These were catastrophes which threatened my personal, professional, and social existence." In August of 1934, Reich presented principles called character analytic vegetotherapy. And this was in a paper called Psychological Contact and Vegetative Current. Reich aimed to dissolve this character armor by applying pressure to certain parts of the body like cheeks, neck, back, thighs, and during a successful session, the patients would actually have waves of pleasure come over their body, which was called the orgasm reflex. In October of 1934, Reich was invited to Norway to talk about character analysis and vegetotherapy. He actually ended up staying there for 5 years, and during this time, he tried to ground the orgasm theory in biology. He tried taking Freud's libido idea and tried to see if it was actually electricity or if it could have been a chemical substance. Reich continued to look for the additional element that had to be present to feel pleasure. He argued that conceiving the orgasm as just a mechanical tension and relaxation could not explain why some people felt pleasure and others didn't. In 1935, Reich started doing experiments with the oscillograph, which is an electrical instrument that graphically displays varying voltage signals. I'm glad that I only poured 5 mils for this layer because I did put quite a bit of copper in here and there's still a little bit of room left. So I think I'm going to go ahead and put some amethyst on here as well. So during these experiments, Reich hooked up volunteers to this machine and he charted their electrical outputs on this oscillograph whilst they kissed and touched each other. Sounds a little weird, doesn't it? But while testing this, he was actually able to find some really cool things, leading him to discover bions. So he actually discovered 2 different kinds of bions. There were PA bions, which were like bigger blue vessels, and then there were smaller red vessels that he called T basilia. And the T stood for Tod in German, which also meant death. Sounds a little morbid, I know, but we will get to why he calls it that in a second here. But Reich argued that bions were to be a rudimentary part of life, and also was the origins of the Orgone theory. I just realized that I keep moving this out of frame, so sorry about that. So anyways, Reich ended up finding the T. bacillia in rotting cancerous cells. So he concluded that orgone energy diminishes over time in cells that have been injured or through aging or through some type of illness. He also believed that death by cancer was from an overwhelming growth of T. bacillia. In 1938, Reich was invited to teach a course on biological aspects of the character formation at the New School, which was a private research university in New York City. The crazy thing is that he actually received his visa and sailed out of Norway on August 19th on the SS Stavangeford, which was the last ship to leave for the US right before World War II broke out. In 1939, after settling in America, Reich claimed that he had found a biological or cosmic energy, also an extension of the libido, called orgone energy or orgone radiation, and he called the study of this orgonomy. He claimed to find orgone energy by injecting bions into mice. He also said that he witnessed it in the night sky through an organoscope, which is basically like a special telescope. He argued that it was omnipresent and described it as a blue or a bluish gray color. And he claimed that humanity had actually divided their knowledge of this into two. One being ether, the physical aspect, and two being God, the spiritual aspect. Also known to some as the seventh element of Earth. In 1940, Reich started to build insulated Freda cages. These cages were actually an enclosure used to block electromagnetic fields. He needed to find a way to isolate and concentrate the orgone energy. Obviously, he wanted to study it more, so he ended up calling these Freda cages that were insulated orgone accumulators. We're going to come back in a few hours and pour another 5 mils over this. I think that'll probably be just right to cover this, and then we will dive into the science behind this. It is another couple of hours later, and it is time to do the last layer on this orgonite here. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last clip, but I did end up putting little chunks of quartz crystal in each of these corners here, which I did get an overhead shot, so you'll be able to see that in that shot there. So these orgone accumulators were constructed very similarly to how we are constructing this orgonite right now. It consisted of layers of alternating metallic and non-metallic material such as wool or plastic or cotton, and basically the organic material will attract, absorb, and hold the orgone energy, while the metallic material will also attract but then will immediately bounce back off in both directions. So he constructed these out of boxes made of the alternating layers, and the innermost layer was sheets of steel. He found that by alternating these layers like this, it actually concentrated the orgone energy inside of the box 3 to 5 times more than the surrounding areas. And obviously, the more layers you have, the more concentration you get in the inside. Reich tested these boxes on mice that were infected with cancer, and after having some very promising results, he decided to build a box big enough for a human. So in 1940 of December, he built a 5-foot orgone accumulator. His idea was basically to have humans sit inside while naked to try and absorb as much energy as possible. So all these patients were terminally ill cancer patients, and their doctors had just basically given up on them. So, I mean, honestly, what was the harm of putting them in this box to see if it would work? And they also signed waivers that said that Reich was not offering a cure, he wasn't promising a cure, and he also was not accepting any type of compensation or money for these treatments. The results on these human tests were actually really incredible. The patients showed decreased pain levels, they had healthier blood counts, they gained weight, and their tumors showed shrinkage and even elimination. Despite this, however, most of the patients did end up dying. This actually reinforced Reich's conviction that cancer was a bioelectric shrinking, following an emotional regression, and that tumors themselves were not actually the disease, but merely a local manifestation of a deeper systemic disorder. In 1941, Reich wrote that orgone is definitely able to destroy cancerous growths. This is proven by the fact that tumors in all parts of the body are disappearing or diminishing. No other remedy in the world can claim such things. Now, he's not claiming that he can cure cancer, he's just claiming that this energy can actually shrink tumors. And obviously, there needs to be more research gone into it to see if they could actually figure out how to manipulate this type of energy to cure cancer. Now, most people know who Albert Einstein is, but if you don't, he's actually a German theoretical physicist. In December of 1940, Reich actually wrote to Einstein telling him about his discoveries, and he agreed to meet Reich, where they talked for over 5 hours. On their second visit, Reich actually gave him a small accumulator, and Einstein spent 10 days constructing different experiments involving temperature variations. He was able to find out that in the middle of these boxes there was a distinct temperature difference. However, after his associate pointed out that the temperature on the ground was higher than the temperature in the ceiling, Einstein attributed it to the variation of temperature in the room. Reich wrote to Einstein for over 3 years without a response, and he started to think that it might have been a conspiracy, perhaps because of the communists. I mean, he wasn't exactly on their great side, and Einstein was German, so, I mean, you know, you can speculate all you want, but I guess we'll never really know. However, in May of 1941, things started going downhill for Reich. He lost his job at the university, and he was told that the institute was inappropriate for his experiments. But I guess you could kind of look at it both ways, because he ended up buying an old farm in Maine, which ended up being way better circumstances and in a better environment for his experiments. The reason for this is that in New York, there's a lot of humidity in the summer, and humidity attracts and holds orgone energy, making his experiments incredibly difficult in the summer. However, in Maine, they have a very low humidity, and the air is extremely clean. So he bought this old farm with 280 acres on it, and he decided that he was going to build an institute for orgonomy study. He named this place Orgone, and he actually ended up moving there full-time. Orgone was completely funded by Reich's personal income, some of his friends' donations, and his following, which was actually starting to grow because orgonomy was starting to expand into biophysics, medicine, and psychiatry all over the country. Reich started to experiment different ways to harness and use orgone, and this is when he started doing the motor force experiments, which were basically motors that were propelled by orgone that was harnessed from the atmosphere. And the cool thing is that the way that you operated these things were with touch. However, though, in May and April of 1947, Reich's reputation took a major down spiral after Mildred Eddy Brady decided to publish a couple of articles in Harper's and the New Republic. These articles were titled "The Strange Case of Wilhelm Reich," with the subtitle "The Man Who Blames Both Neurosis and Cancer on Unsatisfactory Sexual Activity Has Been Reputed by Only One Journal." Brady also falsely claimed that Reich said that he could cure cancer. Reich did give a press release in response to these articles, but unfortunately it was never published. In July of 1947, Dr. J.J. Durrett, the director of the Medical Advisory Division of the Federal Trade Commission, wrote to the FDA asking for an investigation on Freud. The FDA obliged, and they did a full-fledged investigation on Reich. They came to the conclusion that these accumulators were some type of a sexual medical device. Which, to be fair, he did discover this during his research on the orgasm and named it after the orgasm, but I think they read a little bit too much into that, being that after that, everything was just based on orgone energy itself. The FDA tried to find anybody who was dissatisfied with their experience with the orgone accumulator, and fortunately they could not find anybody, but unfortunately they still declared him a fraud of the first magnitude. And from then on out, Reich's work increasingly gained the attention of the officials. In 1951, Reich discovered something that he called deadly orgone radiation, and he believed that this played a role in desertification. So he designed a machine called a cloud buster, and this machine was able to manipulate weather patterns. It could do this by alternating the concentrations of orgone in the atmosphere. They also used water, which strongly attracts orgone energy. The cloud buster was constructed of 15-foot tall hollow pipes that were attached by cables onto a mobile platform, and it was stuck into the water, creating a stronger orgone energy system that was in the surrounding atmosphere by drawing the water through the pipes. The movement of orgone from a lower to a higher energy system was used to create and dissipate clouds. In the year 1953, there was a really bad drought, and the blueberry crop was in dire need of some rain. So some blueberry farmers asked Reich to come over and create some clouds and make some rain, and they would pay him. So on July 6th, he did just that. In the morning, he brought over his cloudbusters, and by that evening, it started to rain, and it rained over 2 inches, saving the entire blueberry crop. In February of 1954, the U.S. Attorney of the District of Maine filed a complaint seeking a permanent injunction to prevent interstate shipments of all Orgone accumulators and materials. He also wanted to ban promotional literature. Judge John D. Clifford Jr. was the judge in charge of this case, and this was Reich's response to this court case. He wrote, "Man's right to know, to learn, to inquire, to make bona fide errors, to investigate human emotions must, by all means, be safe, if the word freedom should ever be more than an empty political slogan. Scientific matters can only be clarified by prolonged, faithful, bona fide observation in friendly exchange of opinion, never by litigation. I, therefore, submit in the name of the truth and justice. I shall not appear in court. My factual position in this case, as well as in the world of science of today, does not permit me to enter the case against the FDA, since such actions would, in my mind, apply admission of the authority of this special branch of government to pass judgment on primordial, pre-atomic, cosmic Orgone energy. I, therefore, rest the case in full confidence in your hands." Unfortunately, this letter was not accepted as a legal valid response, and the injunction was passed on default. That's where we're going to leave the story for tonight. We don't have much more to go in the morning, but we will be demolding this in the morning and finishing our story then. So I will see you then. Good, beautiful morning, everybody. It is the next day. It is time to demold our project and finish our story. So we left off with the injunction being issued by default. So in May of 1956, an associate of Reich's ended up sending a piece of an accumulator, or maybe even like material describing how to make the accumulator. Something involving the accumulator anyways was sent through the mail to an FBI agent posing as a customer. Ooh, this turned out so pretty. Oh my goodness. This is gorgeous. Oh my gosh. I do have to clean up a little bit of overspill on the edges, so I'm going to do that as I finish up this story, and then I will give you guys a really good up-close shot. So obviously Reich was caught in a trap, and the unfortunate thing is that he wasn't even in town when this happened. He was actually in Arizona, and he had either purchased or rented some land over there, and he was using the Arizona desert to perform some cloudbuster experiments. And this was when the accumulator was requested and sent out without Reich even knowing. So naturally, Reich was held in contempt of court. He was actually found guilty and sentenced to 2 years on May 7th, 1956. Reich, who obviously was not a hardened criminal, was going to get out after serving only 1/3 of his time. His release date was set for November 10th of 1957, but unfortunately, he was found dead in his prison cell November 3rd. I mean, I hate to speculate, but like, sounds a little suspicious to me, doesn't it? But who knows, maybe he really did die of natural causes. So real quick, I actually want to read something that Reich had said, and I might also even include the actual audio of him saying this at the end of the video. But he said, "In the course of history of natural science, it always happens that profound or true thoughts or true facts were always either distorted or flattened out. The danger, especially of distortion, is particularly great in the case of orgonomy. We must be scientific. We cannot be political in these matters. And I personally declare that I will be the first to fight with all my strength, with whatever I've got, against such a distortion of our principles." I also want to share with you guys some studies that have gone into orgonomy, but real quick I want to show you a little surprise. I ended up making my dogs these cute little bone-shaped dog tags, and the reason I made them was because they both have really bad anxiety, and I've been wanting to make them these little tags for a while, and I thought how perfect would it be if I incorporated some of the Orgone material in here. Now obviously these molds are not thick enough for me to be able to layer them, but I'm hoping that they will still kind of be able to feel somewhat of the effects. Also, I was thinking, because of the way that I laid them, it might be able to go in sideways and still be able to reflect that energy. We'll see. We'll see if they affect them in any way, but let's quickly pull these out of the molds because I'm really excited to see what they look like. I put amethyst, quartz crystal, and the copper flakes in here. And I did the same thing to this one. I think they both turned out really, really cute. I have a little bit of overspill that I have to fix on this one, but I was able to clean up the overspill on this guy, and I think that it is looking pretty snazzy, if I do say so myself. Okay, now getting into these studies that have been performed on orgonomy or orgone energy. Unfortunately, a lot of these studies have been published in other languages, which obviously creates a little bit of a language barrier for people like myself who only speak English. But I was able to find a couple of good resources that you guys can check out yourself if you would like to. One of them being the Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust, which is basically what controls the museum for Wilhelm Reich. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but Orgone actually is a museum now, and they have cabins that you can rent out. You can even stay in the cabin that Reich lived in, which I think is really cool. And this Wilhelm Reich Infant Trust is basically what runs that, and they also make it their duty basically to share all of Wilhelm Reich's work with the world and future generations to come. Okay, now this next one I'm a little bit worried that I might mispronounce the lab's name, but this is called the Reich Blood Test, or RBT, Heroclitus Labs. I don't know. It's the Hellenic Institute of Orgonomy in Greece, and they basically recreate bioelectrical experiments made by Reich, and they do this by testing blood's vitality. The results are astonishing. They have up to a 70% longer lifespan, proving that orgone energy actually preserves life. The next experiment was done by the University of Pennsylvania, and they experiment with plant seedlings and the structure of water using orgone. I found that this study, I think, is more revolved around the water and how orgone can charge the water and how that charged water affects the seedlings and plants. I feel like structured or charged water is something else that I would really like to dive into on this channel, so if that's something that you're interested in, leave me a comment down below and let me know. The last study that I'm going to talk about is really fascinating in my opinion. It's called the Alexander Golod Pyramid Experiments. And this is basically an experiment done with a 44-meter tall hollowed out plexiglass pyramid, and they did a lot of experiments with like putting things in there, showing that it preserved things, it changed the energy flow around the area. They did some experiments on oil fields where the velocity of oil was actually decreased, making it thinner and easier to pump out. They also did an experiment with a local prison nearby, and they found that the crime rates in the prison dramatically dropped when these pyramids were in the surrounding area. So if you want to look up any of those studies, I will leave all of the links for those studies in the description down below, so that way you can look at them yourself. And that brings us to the end of this video. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, do not forget to subscribe to my channel so that way you can stay up to date with all of my uploads. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye!
It is April 3rd, 1952. I, Wilhelm Reich, I happen to discover the life energy. I know what it means for the future development of medicine, biology, philosophy, and natural science. I'm fully aware of it, and in this awareness, I am completely alone. There's nobody here to listen to what I'm saying. The recording apparatus is the only witness. I hope that someone will, at some time in the future, listen to this recording with great respect for the courage that was necessary to sustain the research work in orgone energy and life energy all through these years.